Yeah, sure. Thanks, Melissa. So just a little bit in terms of background. This is probably the LinkedIn-y stuff, which you may or may not have seen, but I'm a chief people officer. And most of my career has been in the startup and scale-up space, so helping founders figure out how to scale their businesses successfully. Been very fortunate in that. So I guess the ultimate goal for a startup or scale-up is to get to that point where you would exit, where you would float on a stock exchange, or you would, somebody would buy or acquire the business. Been part of that journey a couple of times, which has really been quite interesting to just touch on one of the points Melissa mentioned in terms of seeing how through that growth arc in these types of businesses, how priorities change from a people perspective and certainly from a DE&I perspective, definitely have seen, increasing interest the larger the organization becomes essentially. Currently, I'm still sitting in the space, so I work independently. I work with a range of startups and scale-ups on an advisory perspective. So that's the LinkedIn stuff, as I say. From a personal perspective, my hometown is Cardiff, so I'm a proud Welsh boy. I am in Cardiff at the moment, so we'll be basing myself here for the foreseeable after kind of bouncing around all over the place the past few years. From my perspective, in terms of how I was raised, we were a house that was, I guess, very poor but full of love. And I think I mention that because it's really informed my outlook and my sort of sense of self, and particularly my sense of self as a gay man as well. So I was very fortunate to have grown up in a home where I was very comfortable with my sexuality and made to feel or allowed to feel that way from a very early age.
That's fantastic.
And so that has then translated, I think, into both my comfort out there in the real world and also in the workspace. But I think it does raise some challenges as well. So interestingly, this is the first kind of time I've been invited to speak or taken part in an LGBT oriented session.
Wow.
So yeah, after 10
Yeah.
years in leadership roles in startups and scale
Yeah.
up. So I think that's something that, maybe we'll circle back to a little bit
Yes.
later in the conversation. Aside from that, I am also the world's worst procrastinator. And yeah, I'm kind of leaning into my default anxiety when it comes to, speaking at events and on screen, etc. So I'm a big introvert, so I usually prefer to sort of head down, do my thing in the background. But yeah, delighted to have been invited to join you guys today.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and we are delighted to have you. So thank you very much for that, Daly, in terms of the introduction. So let's move on to talking point number one, where we're asking ourselves, what are the challenges in implementing LGBTQ representation in leadership positions, and how can we sort of mitigate it? If I might open and sort of talk about my own sort of journey, I've sadly really masked my identity at the beginning of my career. I mean, I started out working well over 30 years ago, and my first ever job, I was told I wasn't allowed to wear trousers, never mind a skirt that was not above the knee. So the world has really changed, but that in itself made me internalize my feelings anymore. And my lived experience is that I've always tried to fit in the early days when I came out, the business world and the wider world, and still is, I believe, very heteronormative. So I always felt that I was trying to adjust my behaviour just to be fit in. But on top of that, I always felt pressure to be better than anyone else. I always felt that I had to prove myself, for that promotion. So yeah. So I believe, and this is just my view, that in order to implement real change, to Daly's point, we need more people who are out in senior leadership positions. We also, I believe, need more allyship in the work place. We've obviously had some legislation recently, which means that it's now illegal to, we're protected from a legal point of view in terms of abuse because of sexual orientation, and that will help. But one thing Daly and I touched upon when we were just preparing for this session today is, and I feel exactly the same way, we've only just started to get female representation at board level. We've only just started to have a real focus on BAME representation at board level. And to Daly's point yesterday, we're sort of third in the line. So we're sort of being deprioritized as a minority group. The other thing I've experienced, which I think is a knock-on effect, is that I personally haven't had a good experience of allyship at work. A lot of that is driven by fear. As I just explained myself, I always felt I had to be better than anyone else. And that comes down to LGBTQ individuals, having shame, living with shame. And rather than turning together, we're turning against one another. And if that's playing out in the workplace, how is that playing out in society as a whole? So, Davey, just sort of thinking about that, what points would you like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So I guess, as I mentioned, my lens is very much this sort of startup scale-up world. And so I think for me, despite having been in these leadership roles for several years now, working with global teams, all in the people space, this is just not a subject that people are talking about in the boardroom, in smaller organizations. And so I think if we look at some of the data, so from a UK perspective, the government would classify an SME, so a small to medium enterprise, as a business that has up to 249 employees.
Wow.
So 61% of the workforce actually fall into that bracket.
That category.
The businesses that I tend to work with would go from that size, probably up to 1,000. So, you know, if you were to add another 750 or 751, you know, the percentage is probably up into the 70s, around 3/4 of people working in these smaller organizations. And so the piece that I'm interested to sort of, I guess, try and start a dialogue around is how do we cater to the majority, and we can assume that the majority of the LGBTQ plus community are also working in those non-corporates more broadly. You know, how do we sort of pull together and ensure that in organizations that are poor on resources, poor on time, often battling existential things like how do we raise enough money to keep going, or, you know, what's our cash flow looking like? We've got enough cash flow to see us through another, you know, 6 or 7 months. So in those sorts of real world contexts, you know, I've often found that the conversation around DE&I just, you know, isn't on the table, or to the extent it is, you know, businesses feel that there's very little that they can do to make an impact potentially. So I think that's probably a broader piece, and maybe we can get into some of that with the Q&A at the end. I'd love to hear what, you know,
me too.
What ideas that they have. But I think, again, specifically then from my perspective, I think there are 3 key challenges around the leadership representation. So one is this prioritization piece we've just touched on. The second then is this kind of this PR or tokenistic aspect. So to the extent that businesses can do something, you know, we've seen this with women in the workplace. We've seen this with the BAME community as well. But it's okay. This is a thing. We need to do something about it. Somebody is then normally appointed as the kind of internal czar to do something. And from an LGBTQ perspective, that would probably be the most senior LGBTQ plus person in the business. But then there are no resources. There's no real leadership buy-in. There's no accountability at an organizational level. So it's very difficult, I think, to feel that the work and the desire for change is really there in a meaningful way. And that can be quite a triggering place, right? If you're an LGBTQ plus person in that sort of work environment, where people are saying the right things, but there's no change, and you're still feeling maybe marginalized or overlooked on at one end of the spectrum, or outright discrimination at the other.
At the other end, absolutely right.
Not feeling like you're in a safe space. So I think that's a big issue that I've encountered. And the final point I would make, and I'll sort of pause there, is again from drawing this distinction between corporates and then smaller organizations, specifically startups and scale-ups. You know, what have experienced there, perhaps what that gives us cause for hope. The profile of these businesses are different. So the profile of startups and scale-ups is different. They tend to be younger organizations. Average age is usually in the early 30s. And so what I've often found there is that you're not dealing with the same sort of institutional burden or institutional barriers that you might have in a larger corporate. And so I've wondered, is that part of the reason as well, that maybe a lot of these founders or, you know, smaller entrepreneurs, business owners are perhaps less attuned to it. They maybe don't experience it as
Yes,
being as much of an issue as you might in a larger
yes,
organization.
totally agreed. And the point that I would add to that as well, which we sort of haven't touched on, but it's just come into my mind, so I'll share it with everyone, is the impact. It's well known that LGBTQ individuals struggle with our mental health. And I would say this is exacerbated the more higher up the organization you go. So it may well be that people are not comfortable being their authentic selves because they just don't want to put any more mental pressure on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's great. Thank you very much, Davey. So let's start thinking about what could we do? What could we do to start making a difference at the LGBTQ leadership level?
To me, Melissa?
I don't mind
Yeah.
going first. I've got some ideas.
Okay,
We
yeah, go
need
for it.
we need to be more visible. We need more coalition and closer working at the senior level. I think that's really going to drive change. We talk about this a lot, but you know, representation, seeing someone like you, I think is only going to help other CEOs and CTOs and be their authentic selves. I think that's really going to help, and sort of meaningful stories, you know, which are shared. And also from the employee resource groups, I was on a webinar, I think it was, it was last week. And what they talk about is they have, and this is a real thing, organizations, and that is sort of slightly off topic, but relevant. Organizations are really struggling with the kind of intergenerational workforce. So how we are interacting with one another, you know, Gen Z through to baby boomers. So what this one organization had done is they basically had they had employee resource groups, but with the whole age range, which worked really well because we all communicate differently. So we need to think about how best we can obviously, you know, not promote ourselves per se, but how we can be more visible, but in a way that's adaptive and a way that's progressive and a way that's not seen as aggressive, because all these things count. And for long-lasting change, that's what I think. It's that whole kind of cohesion, working together as a group, and making sure that in your organisation it really is top down. And to your point, Davey, it's not it's not tokenistic, it's not rainbow washing, but it's a real business onus that's directly related to the ROI, because I call my LGBTQ, it's my superpower. We think differently. We've got a really strong community, and I just think, yeah, those sorts of things would happen. What do you think? What would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think for me, so if I talk very much about myself as in
Yes,
what I
yes,
do
please do.
in the workplace, I don't think there's necessarily a secret sauce. I think it's what I've brought to bear in the workplaces that I've been part of and in my leadership roles is firstly being myself. That authenticity is essential, and I think it's sort of fundamental to my DNA and kind of my outlook on things generally. Um, Having said that, that can be very easy to say. But
Yeah,
if being authentic in the workplace is not something, or being authentic about your LGBTQ plus sense of self and identity is not easy to do outside of the workplace, then you know, is that really realistic to do inside of the workplace? So I say that, you know, fully cognizant that there will be very individual and very specific circumstances that will, you know, impact somebody's ability to feel like they can be their authentic selves
yeah, agreed.
inside the workspace.
Yes,
Um,
yes,
but from a leadership perspective, I do think that is important. You know, if you are somebody who's in a leadership role, or if you're in an organization where you have a leader who is part of the LGBTQ plus community, I think I would certainly advocate for opening up a dialogue with them.
yeah,
And, you know, just understanding what their perspective is, or how the extent to which they see themselves and firstly recognize themselves as an LGBTQ plus leader,
yeah,
because they may not. For many years, I didn't. I
yeah,
was just doing my thing, and it, you know,
yeah,
it didn't. I didn't realize and didn't appreciate that actually, yes, head down and doing my thing is great and is fine, but actually, if you can also lift your head
Yes,
and
agreed.
be a more vocal, visible support to another LGBTQ plus person within the organization, or at least be calling out LGBTQ plus issues and concerns in the workplace, almost irrespective of whether or not you think anything might change. And I think that's also an obstacle that we have, right? Sometimes in the workplace, there can be a sense of, well, it is what it is, and
Yeah.
you can adapt to the work environment. But, it does take bravery to sort of call these things out, irrespective of the outcome, but purely because it's the right thing to do.
Yes.
So that piece around, being authentic is
Yes.
important, being visible is important,
Yes.
and, recognizing the responsibility that actually comes with that.
Yeah. 100%.
And a couple more pieces I think I found myself going back to when I was thinking about this topic. Being relevant, I think, is very important. And what do I mean by that? I think this depends on the organization that you're in, but another way of saying this would be good at your job.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Right.
be aware of what the business's priorities are, what the organization's priorities are, what other people's stresses are in the
Yeah.
organization at any one point in time, because that will allow you to really navigate those organizations very well, and will also allow you to seek out potential allies, seek out like-minded people, seek out, people who are having the same concerns about you or want to change similar things. And as we know, that allyship across organizations is essential to getting things done.
Yeah. Totally agree. And just hearing you talk then, it made me sort of, I've written down microaggressions, and it's having the bravery to call out those microaggressions. I can think of so many occasions in my career where I've experienced that, and rather than sort of leaning into it and challenging it, I just wasn't confident enough at the time to,
Likewise, I'm right there next to you.
yeah, to
Yeah.
challenge those behaviors. And going back many, many years, I mean, the prejudice and the questioning around why I was gay was just profound at director level. I mean, happily the world has changed, but it goes back to that. For me, that whole justification piece, I had to have the best wife, I had to have the best car, I had to have the best kids, because I myself was trying to fit in. And I'm just being very open and honest with everyone, vulnerable, that I'm so pleased that that part of my life has passed, and I'm now in a place where I can feel and be my authentic self, because that is what I am, and that motivates me. And like I say, I use it to my superpower. I don't lead with my sexuality. I just talk openly. That's my style. So I'll talk about my wife, I'll talk about my kids. If people want to ask me a question, I'm very happy, because if it's educational, I get asked all the time, for example, oh, who carried? Are you the real mum? With both mums? Just things like that. I don't mind that. But thank you. That's really interesting. And I suppose the last thing I just wanted to sort of think about is, and this, you raised this point,
Melissa, sorry, can I jump in? Because I
yeah,
do think there's another piece there. So you've got me on a roll here.
yeah, go.
So firstly, just in terms of what you were saying, I think there's an accountability piece as well, which is a theme. So, even if you're in an environment where there are things that you want to change about that environment, and there may not be other people around that kind of, are part of the community or you think would represent your interests.
Yes.
Being brave, as you said, speaking up, there's a real personal accountability that comes with that. And if we don't, then it's not going to change.
So true.
I would also question, if you're feeling like this in your respective organizations in a consistent way, is that the right organization for you?
Yeah.
And of course, people stay in organizations for all sorts of very practical reasons, but having that conversation with yourself,
Yeah.
is this organization serving me well?
Yeah.
Or am I, being triggered on a daily basis? Even just acknowledging that truth to yourself, if you are in an organization that's pretty difficult and challenging from an LGBTQ plus perspective, then perhaps making peace with the idea that, okay, I need to leave the organization at some point. I need to see what else is out there and seek that somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important to, to be brave and to speak out. but, I have friends both in the LGBTQ plus community and also in the Black community who have been those people in the organization who have spoken out, and it's just taken such a toll on them that they step away. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was just sort of responding to what you.
No, great, thank you.
And then to go back to my little talking points, there was, we spoke about being myself in organizations, being visible in organizations, being relevant in organizations.
Yeah.
And I think the last piece as well is just being accessible in organizations. So ensuring that people know that you have an open door, you are somebody that they can come and speak to.
Yes.
About anything, it can be something serious, something light, something work-related, maybe something not work-related. But I think going out of your way to ensure that, LGBTQ plus populations in your organization know that they can come to you and you have that open door is important.
Yeah, it's so true. In fact, the last organization that I worked for, it's only since I've left that I've realized which of them was LGBTQ plus, and that's a really good point, because had I known, I would have engaged. But then I was very, very out, and have been out for a while. But some of the individuals, they just weren't. So that's a really interesting point. So,
Melissa, could I zoom in just on something that the both of you touched on, because I think it's very juicy. There's a certain level, I guess, of fatigue and tiredness that you have always having to be really good at what you're doing so that you can prove why you deserve to be there. When you have people who might be in the majority who are comfortably mediocre and they don't have to go prove anything to show why they're there. And so when it comes to how you are able to just, I don't know, the concept of bringing yourself to work, it has to be a safe space. And the only real way that you can work through that is with, I guess, the empathy and understanding. So here is the mind-blowing moment, because, when a company is like starting to retract their advocacy, they're taking down their banners and they're doing less because they're afraid of what that might have an impact on their bottom line. Yes. There is this fear there of what will happen to them if they're seen to be associated. So they actually can empathize with what, discrimination feels like. They just haven't connected the dots. And so helping to understand that actually that thing that you're afraid of, by you not supporting us, you're letting that come. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a common thread there that people just haven't connected.
Yes, definitely. And that links into to my point around the multi-generational workforce. How do we communicate? That the world is quite woke. It's seen as another minority group that wants focus and attention. It's like, you're right, everyone is getting sort of tired of it, really. And actually, thank you, Caitlin. This leads very nicely into our sort of last talking point for the day, and that's asking ourselves, are LGBTQ plus people good leaders at Daily? I'll hand over to you for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that the guys, Melissa and I, were just sort of kicking around, in preparing for this, because, it occurred to me, of course, the topic of this book. But then, there is an assumption in there, or there's possibly something that we should interrogate, which is to what extent are, that are LGBTQ plus leaders in the workplace good leaders. And for me, that came from one of my experiences, probably one of my worst and most disappointing experiences of leadership, where I was being led by somebody who's part of the community. But I found that experience, my experience of them, to be they were very upwardly sycophantic in one aspect, and then another aspect, downwardly disempowering, sort of verging on hostile at times. So there is I think we as we have these conversations, we do need to be cognizant of the fact that not everybody, of course, in the LGBTQ plus community is going to think the same thing about leadership or want the same things from leadership. So I think it is important to recognize that. But yeah, going beyond that, I think there's a big piece that we can do potentially to, on an individual level and possibly on a community level, to ask ourselves the question of, what does it mean to be a good leader, first and foremost? Because to be, a leader in the LGBTQ plus community, you have to be able to lead.
Yeah.
So, to what extent does that community then want the same things from its leaders, and how can we improve potentially the capability of LGBTQ plus leaders through things like training, through coming together, having dialogue, etc. So yeah, I'm quite big on leadership. I've seen most of the organizations that I've been in on the startup and scale up side. When it goes south, it's gone south because of poor leadership, invariably every time. So I feel like I've become attuned to the dangers and the damage that poor leadership can do. So, so I think it's important for us to be honest with ourselves as well about where we're at. Capability and our comfort in taking the lead, given that we're coming from the experience of often having closed ourselves off in many aspects.
No, there's some great points there, Daly. Thank you very much. In fact, at this point, I would like to reference an organisation that we have come across in our sort of research for today, an organisation which Dinny will share in the chat at the end of the session, called Clu'd Leadership. They are conducting an LGBTQ plus survey on how we can thrive in the workplace. So they've got some really interesting people in their organisation, obviously identifying as LGBTQ plus. So I would encourage you to do that. And actually, there's a webinar next Tuesday, which is very much focused on how we can thrive. So if we help ourselves thrive through the organisation from those early career points, as I discussed, I'm a very different person today than I was, 20, 25 years ago. I would encourage everyone to put your arms around that organisation, because they're wanting to do really good things.
We've got a question. This one is for you, Daly. So it's from Tara. What would you like to see change in the DE&I narrative for leadership teams specifically?
Hey, Tara, thanks for the question. Oof, that's a big one. I guess, again, drawing on my experience. So from a DE&I perspective, where the organizations that I've felt do DE&I well is where they've adopted a genuinely inclusive approach to DE&I. So the kind of counterpoint to that is where I've often been frustrated in organizations where they're opposed to DE&I is if we take ERG groups, for example. My experience of ERG groups in organizations has been very mixed. I think oftentimes I've found, let's say the LGBTQ plus groups, I found them very cliquey. I found that they don't actually represent my interests particularly well, or that they are, maybe perhaps a certain type of group. They may just focus on the social aspect, which is important, but not want to talk about internal policies on improving the organization, or the other way around. So again, it's often, I think, a difficult circle to square to kind of appeal to everyone. But from DE&I and leadership, I think that the key then is in the second part of your question, Tara, which is around leadership teams developing, and this is bouncing off, I guess, what point I've just touched on, which is how can DE&I develop leadership capability for LGBTQ plus individuals within organizations. And leadership, let's not forget, leadership is a mindset. It's got nothing to do with seniority. Absolutely nothing to do with seniority. That may or may not, come down the line. But I think it's how do we as a community share insights and knowledge and expertise on how to operate effectively in an organization.
Yes.
I think once you can start to tap into some of that, it really can help create a sense of, okay, I do belong here. I do know how to affect change here. And I think that can then, potentially open up other opportunities to drive a broader DE&I agenda.
Yeah, agreed.
I hope that was helpful, Tara.
She says thank you. Yeah, where I've seen employee, just you made me think of something, employee resource groups done very well was actually, I'm trying to think now, probably about 10 years ago when I was working as a supplier to Sky. And they introduced, we called it Rainbow Laces Day. So it was that everyone in the organisation was handed rainbow laces. It was in Pride Month. So that whole kind of collective piece, not in isolation. And it was absolutely, wonderful. They were very good at looking internally, and the resource groups there were particularly good. So I just wanted to call out, a good experience. And that also they did a really great campaign around storytelling, a job that you love to talk about. So they were excellent at making sure that there was, representation across the whole spectrum. In fact, one of the first organisations that were really sort of pioneering and embraced it. And they had a really strong ED&I culture and some amazing advocates. And I had the pleasure of going back there on Monday this week to see some of those individuals. So yeah, that's a company that I would call out and say they are doing it extremely well.
I think interesting as well, the minority communities, we've touched on women, Black and ethnic minority, and of course LGBTQ plus. There's often a sense that you're competing for the same resources. Well, of course, the lived experience of those communities is very different, and even more so if you're intersectional. But I think the interests of those communities, given where we are probably more aligned than not.
Yeah.
So I think there's probably a broader conversation to have around how do the minority groups in an organization pull together to create policies that are genuinely inclusive for all. Yeah. Rather than let's solve a little piece over here or try and solve our area, you take a step back and just start from the perspective of fundamentally what is the right thing to do here. Then that is normally a good starting point for any organization.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Davey. Kaylin, do we have any other questions coming in?
I have a question. And that question is just, I guess, in relation to, you definitely do see people sort of being a bit sort of afraid to speak up or to be visibly in support of, like, quietly behind closed door, they're like, yeah, I'm with you. But like having that sort of courage to be a visible ally and to be vocal, I'm seeing that sort of slip. And so I guess my question is, what do you have to say to people who have that fear of being, of speaking up?
Is that to me?
Yeah, well, to either.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, certainly. It comes down to, I think, Daly was saying, understanding it. We all learn differently. We all have different styles. How can you adapt? Because the loudest voice isn't necessarily the best voice in a room. And there are many ways that people can be allies without necessarily, being visible, even if it's just becoming part of an ERG, employee resource group, I don't know, signing a petition, just something. It's about really progressive change. And as Daly was saying, we have to be brave. I have had to be quite brave on many occasions, because to Daly's point, otherwise the change is not going to come. But I'm highly conscious of style and coming to people, as I was saying, I'm happy to educate them, come at them in a non-aggressive way, because sometimes it is just curiosity and they may have felt uncomfortable asking the question in the first place. So I'm always thinking about the future generation having two small children, 11 and 8. By the time they get to my lovely ripe-old age, I want things to be so different. And that's just my personal view. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I think I would start by acknowledging it's very difficult. If you're not an outspoken, a very vocal person or communicative person, then this can feel like torture, even contemplating speaking up. So it's definitely going to be a case of finding your feet. What I would suggest from a practical perspective is maybe to try a number of different strategies. So Melissa, I think you mentioned a few things. There may be something that you can do in terms of starting a group or joining a group internally, allies, maybe sending a note or asking for a conversation with somebody that you do trust in the organization to sound them out. So I think there's a whole range of things that you can potentially do, but what I would say is building up that courage to start. If you're feeling strongly about something, then it's as much a service to yourself as to anybody else to speak up.
Yes.
And I was speaking with my coach earlier today, actually, and I'll share it with you guys because I love this phrase. And he was speaking to me. He said that you can either. We were talking about. I sometimes have. I find it difficult to focus on things and to execute things. So I'm very much a sort of a front person, more sort of ideas and visioning stuff and strategy, and then his execution down the line. And that's been a source of frustration for me in personal projects as much as work. So I give that context so that you understand where the quote comes from. But what he said was that you can either get busy playing small or you can get busy living big. And it just really landed with me. So my mantra for this week is live big, live big. But there is something that is quite empowering in that, right? Because we spend our times being busy worrying about stuff, or you can spend your time being busy doing something about it. It's still the same amount of time that you're going to spend. There are only a finite number of hours in a day or a week. But the impact and the effect on your kind of well-being of maybe getting busy and doing something about something rather than just sort of thinking about it and making yourself small is going to be night and day. And that's how we can step into a space on an individual perspective and then also as a wider community where you feel comfortable in any room that you walk into.
Yeah, definitely. And to add to that point, whenever I'm engaged or someone is asking me, I think a lot of the fear is around ignorance, not because we are not sort of visible. So also leaning into the fact it's okay to have a difference of opinion. Sometimes people will raise those things with me. Oh, I'm so sorry, I know you're gay. It's like, fine, it's okay. It's okay to have your opinion. It's okay to think that there's too much representation on television. That was a conversation I had recently with a friend. She was just, come on, you gays, you're everywhere. It's gone to the other sort of side of the spectrum. But that is her view, right? So the way that I can change that is, which is what I did in terms of educating her, that the mainstream media does need to change to encourage positivity and us being seen in a much better light. Thanks, Dave. That was a good point.
Got another question coming in hot. So when it comes to both of your experience in organizations where there are like allyship groups and circles and employee resource groups, the selection process and the people who end up in there, what has your experience been and what have you seen in terms of they're choosing people from certain groups, or is it actually representative?
You want to go, Daddy? I can certainly talk about
it. You could probably see there's some twitches on my face.
I feel like
not great, and this maybe speaks to the kind of cliquey aspect that I mentioned earlier, right? So it can often be quite opaque how the groups are set up in the first instance. And the kind of the mandate that the groups have is often not very clear. Is it top down? Is it bottom up? Is anybody like in charge, coordinating? It can feel like, so I think it's very easy when setting up ERG groups to feel like you're on the outside, or if you come into an organization where there is already an ERG group, to kind of join that group and make an impact might feel like a bit of an uphill struggle if the group isn't necessarily set up or aligned in a way that kind of works for you. There's very mixed. What I would say, just again to give a counter to that, is the best group. The approach that we took at one of my previous companies that worked very well, was we had just a people forum. And so we didn't have separate ERG groups. We had a people forum where that was not run by the leadership. It was run by the employees. They would come together on a monthly basis and discuss issues, concerns, frustrations, what needed to change. Because there's no leadership in the room, it felt like a safer space automatically. But then we would I as chief people officer at the time, would then get a kind of a download of what they discussed, what the concerns were, what they wanted to change. And that worked very well kind of like on a regional basis or an office basis, because people are experiencing the same issues. Slightly different if you've got a fully remote team, but again, there's no reason that you couldn't come together online and then sort of feed those concerns collectively then into the leadership. So that worked really well, we found.
Perfect. No, I do agree. My experience at corporates, as I've just highlighted, it is much better than the experience I've had of employee resource groups in sort of smaller sized organisations like you, Daly. I felt in those sort of smaller companies, it's very tokenistic. It's so that you can put it in a bid to win business. We're doing this, you know, and it just hasn't changed anything because it hasn't been set up in the right way. But I guess one way to focus on the successes, the outputs, and people being comfortable about declaring their sexual orientation, your representation figures. I think once you can see an improvement there, then you know that your employee resource groups are working and making a difference.
We've got another question. I potentially make it the and they're coming in hot. Let's see if we can get as many of these in as we can. But it's kind of that same question, but in reverse. Like, do you think that it is possible and or effective, the concept of reverse mentoring, where perhaps you have a leadership group that is not diverse or representative, and the organization being able to kind of train upwards? Have you ever seen that work?
Sorry, oh, Taylor, you're going to take that. Great.
Yeah, happy to take that one. That's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. I think it relies on, first of all, it puts a lot of emphasis, of course, on people who are, by definition, kind of less empowered in your organization if you're at a more junior level. So you do really have to then think about how effectively you can speak with a collective voice. Because it's very easy to sort of almost close doors or close rank if you're at that leadership level, or to not really see it as an issue. But again, the theme of, you know, some of the points that we've been making is it's still worth having that discussion and thinking about it. And the approach would be, my approach would be to try and find like the weak link, I guess, in that closed circle. So again, the weak link or / strongest ally, the person who is most sympathetic, I think, to whatever it is you're wanting to change, and have a conversation with them. I mean, if you can co-opt one individual, you know, to support you or to guide you or to coach you through having that broader conversation or getting that key point on the leadership agenda, then that's probably the practical approach that I would take. But yeah, it can be quite tough when you've got a leadership team that is maybe very exclusive, pretty homogenous, and may or may not be interested in anything to do with DE&I.
I've got a juicy question from Jess, and I might actually target, it's for both, but I might start with you, Melissa, just because I think it really speaks to kind of what we do at Clu'd. The question is, how could, from a talent acquisition perspective, like an organization show and or attract members of the LGBTQ+ community without the individuals feeling tokenized? For example, like, are you getting this because you're queer or because you belong to whichever group? How can you do that without that feeling like the reason that they got through?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you, Jess. So from a talent acquisition point of view, you need to hone in on skills. It's all about skills-based hiring. If you are hiring someone for the skills that they have for the job, it's not going to feel tokenistic. And then you are going to be able to go out into those communities, the people that you want to attract, that you want to represent in your organization. So leading with the skills. Also, throughout the talent acquisition process, making those individuals feel really safe, so and comfortable, that they're happy to declare their sexual orientation. So what we do specifically at Clu'd is we have a partner network. We don't let our organizations work with our partner network until they're a verified employer, so that they are checked for bias before we start working with them. They're checked for safeguarding, because our community, whether you're neurodiverse, LGBTQ+, trans, have different needs. So that's how we work at Clu'd, to safeguard. And also, it's not about the volumes of people that you're trying to attract, it's about the quality of the applicants. So we lead first with that at Clu'd, which is proven to be working, which is great news. Hopefully that answers the question, Kevin.
Yeah, well, and if I could add a bit of spice to it, just from the perspective of, because, you know, meritocracy as a concept something that will get eyeball rolls, because it's like, you know, when you take a look at a process, you know, like a project manager, for example, you've got the single mum with a couple of 0-hour contracts, and then you've got the graduate from Uxbridge. Like, who can actually do it versus who's more likely to get the opportunity? And so when we talk about merit, it can be dicey because processes themselves are not anchored to merit. And that's why when you're taking a look at what it actually takes to do it well, and you start to change my hearts and minds around who is capable of doing it. So I would just throw my hat in the ring to say skills is a great way to do that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I would agree. I think, you know, having an objective process from a hiring perspective is essential, as objective as possible.
Yeah.
There is another piece. I'll just very quickly, I know we're running out of time, but within this question, I think it also raises to me the distinction between what we do to attract people externally and then what the reality is of, you know, the internal experience of an organization. So something that I and others in my TA teams have been very vocal about internally and in our organizations is that, you know, we can do a great job selling and looking good on the outside, but, you know, are our people policies, processes and procedures inclusive internally? To what extent is the experience of our existing LGBTQ plus community a positive one? To what extent does that community feel safe in the organization? And to do some of the things that we've spoken about, you know, to what extent does that community feel comfortable speaking up and, you know, vocal and visible, etc. So I think it's also having an eye as we're thinking about hiring and attracting, you know, diverse people into an organization. You have to have a very strong gaze on that internal piece, because if there's a disconnect between what you're selling and what that experience is, they will leave, or they will have a, you know, a terrible experience, and nobody wins. It's a lose-lose. So yeah, I think it's important to sort of bear that in mind as well.
Great point about retention, and we know that it costs businesses on average £30,000 per individual that doesn't work out post being hired. So thank you very much, Daly, for that. Do we have any time for any more questions, Kaylin?
I think it's the wrap-up sequence.
Oh, okay. Well, look, thank you from the bottom of my heart, Daly. It's been a really interesting session. I'm personally very glad that we're in one another's network, which is great. I love increasing my network, LGBTQ plus or not. Thank you to everyone in the audience for asking the questions. I'm so sorry we've run out of time. Please connect with me on LinkedIn if anyone would like to follow on from these conversations. I'd be more than happy. As I say, always looking to increase my network. But thank you, Daly, and thank you to everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, could I just add a close as well?
Yeah.
Guys, anybody on the call, just to echo Melissa, I know it's been a dialogue led by us today, but if you have specific questions to anything that's occurring in your world, feel free to just ping me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to, you know, to have a chat at any point in time. And if you're a leader yourself, coming back to my soapbox, but the three takeaways for me thinking about LGBTQ plus leadership that are maybe action points for anybody that's interested would be: one, think about how you can develop yourself as a leader. And again, that's about mindset, not seniority. Two, seek out mentors in your workspace, whether they're part of the community or an ally. And then three, think about how you can become a mentor to somebody else and how you can maybe help somebody else feel more comfortable in their shoes and own this space.
Lovely. Thank you, Daly. Super. Well, listen, everyone, enjoy your day, the rest of the day, enjoy your sunshine. Thank you for joining us. Please do come along to the next webinar. We'd love to see you again, and it's been great. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.